The dust-coated street of Redemption Springs shimmered in the late afternoon heat as Ruby Lawson pressed her back against the bank's wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frightened bird. She'd come to withdraw the last of her father's savings, not to become entangled in a robbery. Yet here she was, frozen in terror as masked men thundered through the bank's doors, guns blazing, leaving chaos and 3 dead bodies in their wake. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild, untamed, and merciless. Ruby had managed to slip out the back door during the commotion, clutching her small satchel containing the meager $23 that represented her entire inheritance. She'd made it halfway down the alley when a shadow fell across her path. Looking up, she found herself staring into the coldest blue eyes she'd ever seen, belonging to a man whose face was partially obscured by a bandana, but whose gun was pointed directly at her heart. "Well, what have we here?" His voice was low, dangerous. "Looks like someone's trying to run off with our earnings." "This is mine," Ruby said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her fear. "My father's savings. Please, I had nothing to do with—" "Shut your mouth," he snarled, cocking his revolver. "Hand it over, or I'll put a bullet through you right here." Ruby clutched the satchel tighter, tears springing to her eyes. This money was all she had left in the world after her father's passing last month. Without it, she'd have nothing, no means to pay the mortgage on their small ranch, no way to keep food on her table. Death seemed almost preferable to the destitution that awaited her. "Please don't shoot," she begged, a desperate idea forming. "Take me instead." The outlaw's eyes narrowed, confusion momentarily replacing the cold calculation in his gaze. From around the corner of the bank came the sound of hoofbeats. A rider appeared at the entrance to the alley, his horse rearing as he pulled it to an abrupt halt. The newcomer was tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. In one fluid motion, he drew his gun and aimed it at the outlaw. "Drop it, Dirk," he commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of law. The outlaw Dirk spun around, momentarily forgetting Ruby as he faced this new threat. The standoff lasted only seconds before Dirk made his decision, firing wildly at the rider before turning to run down the alley. The rider returned fire with deadly accuracy. Ruby watched in horror as Dirk stumbled, clutched his chest, and crumpled to the ground. The rider dismounted, approaching cautiously with his gun still drawn. He nudged the fallen outlaw with his boot, then bent to check for signs of life. Finding none, he holstered his weapon and turned his attention to Ruby. For the first time, she could see his face clearly weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw partially covered by stubble, and eyes the deep green of pine forests. He wasn't wearing a badge, but there was something about him that spoke of justice rather than lawlessness. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, removing his hat and revealing thick, sandy brown hair. Ruby shook her head, unable to find her voice as the events of the past few minutes caught up with her. Her knees buckled, and the stranger moved quickly to catch her before she hit the ground. "Easy there," he said, his voice gentler now. "My name's Gabriel Wade. Most folks call me Gabe." "Ruby," she managed. "Ruby Lawson. Miss Lawson, we need to get you somewhere safe. The rest of Dirk's gang won't be far behind, and they'll be mighty upset when they realize he's not coming back." "The bank," Ruby whispered. "There are people hurt inside." Gabe nodded grimly. "Sheriff's already there with the deputy. I was tracking these outlaws when I heard the commotion. Come on, I'll take you to the doctor's office to make sure you're all right." As he helped Ruby to her feet, the sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the bank, followed by shouts and the thunder of hooves. "Too late," Gabe muttered. "They're making their escape." He looked down at Ruby, indecision in his eyes. "I should go after them, but—" "Go," Ruby insisted, finding her strength returning. "I can make it to the doctor's on my own." Gabe hesitated, then nodded. "Stay in the alley until they've passed. Then head straight for Doc Miller's. It's the white building with the green door, just past the general store." He mounted his horse with practiced ease, then paused, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll find you later, Miss Lawson. There's something about what happened here that doesn't sit right." Before she could respond, he was gone, spurring his horse toward the main street in pursuit of the fleeing gang. Ruby waited until the sounds of chaos had faded before making her way to the doctor's office as instructed. The town was in an uproar, people gathered in the street, talking in hushed, frightened tones about the robbery. She kept her head down, clutching her satchel, still stunned by her close brush with death. Doc Miller was overwhelmed with the wounded from the bank, but he insisted on checking Ruby over despite her protests that she was unharmed. She sat quietly on a wooden chair in the corner of his crowded office, watching as he and his wife worked tirelessly to tend to those with bullet wounds and other injuries. It was nearly dusk when the door opened and Gabe Wade stepped inside. His clothes were dustier than before, and there was a grin set to his mouth that told Ruby his pursuit had not been entirely successful. He spotted her immediately, crossing the room in a few long strides. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for any signs of injury. "Yes," Ruby nodded. "Just shaken. Did you catch them?" Gabe shook his head. "Got one of them, but the others escaped with the money. For now." He lowered his voice. "Miss Lawson, I need to speak with you privately. What you said to Dirk back there in the alley." It wasn't just the words of a frightened woman, was it? Ruby stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Take me instead," Gabe quoted. "You knew him, didn't you?" Ruby glanced around nervously at the crowded room. "Not here," she whispered. Gabe offered her his hand. "My horse is outside. I can take you home, and we can talk on the way." Ruby hesitated only briefly before accepting his help. Something about Gabriel Wade made her trust him, despite having just met under the most harrowing circumstances. Outside, the evening air had cooled, bringing relief from the day's heat. Gabe's horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, stood patiently at the hitching post. Gabe helped Ruby mount, then swung up behind her with graceful efficiency. "Which way?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. "North, along the creek road. It's about 3 miles out of town." As they rode, Ruby found herself acutely aware of the stranger whose arms encircled her to hold the reins. He smelled of leather, gunpowder, and something distinctly masculine that she couldn't quite name. She'd never been this close to a man who wasn't family, and despite the circumstances, she found herself noticing the strength in his forearms, visible where he'd rolled up his sleeves. "Now, Miss Lawson," Gabe said as they left the town behind, "I think you owe me an explanation." Ruby sighed, knowing she couldn't avoid the truth. "I recognized Dirk's voice. He used to work for my father on our ranch about a year ago. I never saw his face clearly today because of the bandana, but I know it was him. And you offered yourself in place of the money because I knew he wouldn't kill me," Ruby admitted. "Dirk always had an interest in me. My father fired him when he caught him trying to force his attentions on me in the barn one evening." She felt Gabe's body tense behind her. "Did he hurt you?" "No," Ruby said quickly. "My father arrived before anything happened. But Dirk swore he'd be back someday to take what he wanted. I think today might have been his chance, if you hadn't arrived when you did." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the evening chorus of crickets. "Miss Lawson," Gabe finally said, "I'm not just a bounty hunter. I'm also a federal marshal, though I don't advertise the fact. I've been tracking the Bolton gang for 6 months now, across 3 territories." "The Bolton gang?" Ruby turned slightly to look at him over her shoulder. "Dirk was one of them. They're led by a man named Victor Bolton, former Confederate officer turned outlaw. They've robbed banks from Texas to Wyoming, leaving a trail of bodies behind them. And now they're here," Ruby whispered. "Yes, and I need to know why they chose Redemption Springs." "It's hardly the richest town in the territory." Ruby was silent for a long moment. "They might have come because of me," she finally said. "If Dirk told them about my father's ranch." "What's special about your ranch?" "Nothing now," Ruby said bitterly. "But my father struck gold on our property last year. It wasn't much, just enough to pay off our debts and set aside a little savings. Dirk knew about it, though. He might have thought there was more." Gabe nodded thoughtfully. That would explain why they seemed disappointed with the bank's take. One of them was shouting about the real prize as they fled. Ruby's blood ran cold. "You think they're coming for me? For the ranch?" "It's possible," Gabe admitted. "Which is why I'm not leaving you alone tonight." They had reached a fork in the road, and Ruby pointed to the right-hand path. "It's just over that rise." As they crested the hill, Ruby's modest ranch came into view, a small cabin with a barn and corral, nestled against a backdrop of pine trees with a creek running along one side. It wasn't much, but it was home, the only one she'd ever known. Gabe helped Ruby dismount when they reached the cabin, then tended to his horse while she unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin was neat but sparse: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair by the window. 2 doors led off to what Gabe presumed were bedrooms. "It's not much," Ruby said, lighting a lamp. "But it's mine, at least for now." "For now?" Gabe raised an eyebrow. Ruby set the lamp on the table and sank into one of the chairs. "The bank holds the mortgage. My father took out a loan to buy more cattle last spring, before we found the gold. When he died last month, the banker, Mr. Hollister, told me I have until the end of summer to pay it off, or he'll foreclose." "And that's why you were at the bank today?" Gabe said, understanding dawning. "To make a payment." Ruby nodded. "With what little I had left. Now, if the Bolton gang is coming here looking for gold that doesn't exist anymore, we'll deal with that if it happens," Gabe said firmly, taking the other chair. "For now, let me worry about the gang. You've been through enough today." Ruby studied him in the lamplight. "Why are you helping me, Marshal Wade? Surely capturing the Bolton gang is more important than babysitting a rancher's daughter." Gabe's expression softened. "When I rode into that alley and saw you standing there, facing down a killer with nothing but your courage, something changed for me. In that moment, when you said, 'Take me instead,' I knew I'd do anything to protect you." He looked down, seemingly embarrassed by his admission. "I can't explain it better than that." Ruby felt a warm flush spread across her cheeks. "That's a lot of feeling for a woman you just met, Marshal." "Gabe," he corrected. "And yes, it is. But I've learned to trust my instincts in my line of work. They're telling me that you're worth protecting, Ruby Lawson, and not just because you might be the key to catching the Bolton gang." The way he said her name sent a shiver through Ruby that had nothing to do with fear. There was something about Gabriel Wade that called to her, despite the dangers surrounding them and the brevity of their acquaintance. "I should check the perimeter," Gabe said, rising from his chair. "Make sure everything's secure for the night. Do you have any weapons in the house?" "My father's rifle is over the fireplace," Ruby said, "and I keep a shotgun in my bedroom." Gabe looked impressed. "You know how to use them?" "My father made sure of it. He said a woman alone in these parts needs to know how to defend herself." "Smart man. Your father." Gabe nodded approvingly. "I'll be back shortly." After he left, Ruby moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire that had burned down to embers, putting coffee on to boil, and slicing bread and cheese for a simple meal. It felt strange to be preparing food for a man again after a month alone, but not unpleasant. When Gabe returned, he hung his hat on a peg by the door and removed his gun belt, though he kept it within easy reach. "Everything looks quiet," he reported. "I moved my horse into your barn and made sure all the outbuildings are locked up tight." "Thank you," Ruby said, setting 2 plates on the table. "It's not much, but you must be hungry after the day you've had." Gabe smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "It looks like a feast to me. I've been living on trail rations for weeks." They ate in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Ruby couldn't help stealing glances at her unexpected protector. In the warm glow of the lamplight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun, and a thin scar that ran along his jawline. His hands were strong but gentle as they handled the simple china, and she found herself wondering what those hands would feel like against her skin. She pushed the thought away, embarrassed by the direction her mind had wandered. This man was a federal marshal, here to do a job, not to court a penniless rancher's daughter. "Tell me about yourself, Marshal Wade," she said, breaking the silence. "What brings a man like you to this life?" Gabe looked up, a shadow crossing his face. "I was a cavalry officer during the war. Afterward, I tried settling down, even got engaged to a girl back in Missouri. But then she and her family were killed by outlaws while I was away on business." His voice grew tight with old pain. "I joined the marshals after that, determined to bring men like those to justice." "I'm sorry," Ruby said softly. "That's a heavy burden to carry." Gabe nodded. "It was for a long time. But lately—" He looked at her directly, his green eyes intense. "Lately I've started to wonder if there might be more to life than vengeance and duty." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Ruby was the first to look away, rising to clear the plates. "You should take my father's room tonight," she said. It's the door on the right. I'll make up the bed with fresh sheets. I'll sleep out here, Gabe insisted. Near the door, in case of trouble. Ruby didn't argue, recognizing the logic in his decision. She gathered blankets and a pillow from the linen chest and helped him make a pallet near the fireplace. I'll bank the fire before I turn in, she said. Will you be warm enough? I've slept in worse conditions, Gabe assured her. Go get some rest, Ruby. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do about the Bolton gang. Ruby hesitated at the door to her bedroom. Gabe, thank you for saving my life today and for staying to protect me tonight. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Gabe's expression was gentle in the firelight. Some things aren't done expecting repayment, Miss Lawson. Good night. Good night, Marshal Wade. Ruby replied softly, closing her door. In the privacy of her room, Ruby changed into her nightdress and sat on the edge of her bed, her mind whirling with the events of the day. From the terror of the bank robbery to the strange, powerful connection she felt with Gabriel Wade, it was almost too much to process. She moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to look out at the night. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light over her small ranch. It looked peaceful, beautiful even, but Ruby knew that danger lurked beyond the seemingly tranquil scene. Somewhere out there, the Bolton gang was planning their next move. And for reasons she didn't fully understand, Ruby believed they would come for her, just as Gabe had suggested. With a sigh, she returned to her bed and slipped under the covers, extinguishing the lamp on her bedside table. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind against the windows had her tensing, listening for the approach of danger. But underlying her fear was a strange sense of security, knowing that Gabriel Wade was just on the other side of her door, standing between her and whatever threats might come. In the main room, Gabe lay awake on his makeshift bed, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. He hadn't told Ruby the whole truth about why he was tracking the Bolton gang with such determination. Victor Bolton had been among the outlaws who killed his fiancée and her family 4 years ago. This pursuit was personal, a vendetta as much as a duty. Yet today, when he'd seen Ruby standing in that alley, something had shifted inside him. For the first time in years, he'd felt something other than the cold drive for justice that had sustained him. There was a warmth now, a spark of something he'd thought long dead. I'd die for you, he whispered to the darkness, echoing the words that had passed through his mind in that alley when he'd seen her courage in the face of death. Words he hadn't spoken aloud, but had felt with a certainty that shook him to his core. It made no sense. They'd just met. But Gabe had long ago learned that life's most important truths often defied rational explanation. Outside, a twig snapped. Gabe was on his feet instantly, gun in hand, moving silently to the window. In the moonlight, he could make out a figure moving toward the barn. Just one, moving cautiously, pausing to check his surroundings. A scout, Gabe realized. The gang was here, or at least checking to see if this was indeed where they might find the real prize they sought. Moving to Ruby's door, he knocked softly. She opened it almost immediately, fully dressed, her father's shotgun in her hands. You heard it too? She whispered. Gabe nodded, impressed by her readiness. Just one man, heading for the barn. Probably scouting for the rest of the gang. What do we do? We need to capture him alive, Gabe said. Find out what their plan is, how many more might be coming. Ruby's expression was resolute. I can help. Gabe started to protest, then thought better of it. This was her home, and she clearly knew how to handle herself. All right, but stay behind me and do exactly as I say. They slipped out the back door, moving silently around the cabin toward the barn. The moon had gone behind a cloud, leaving them in relative darkness as they approached. The barn door was ajar, a sliver of lantern light visible from within. Gabe motioned for Ruby to stay back as he eased the door open wider, his gun ready. Inside, a man was rifling through the tack room, muttering to himself as he tossed aside saddles and bridles, clearly searching for something. That's far enough, Gabe said, stepping into the barn with his gun leveled at the intruder. Hands where I can see them. The man spun around, reaching for his gun. Gabe was faster, firing a shot that knocked the weapon from the outlaw's hand. Next one goes through your heart, Gabe warned. Now, hands up and tell me what you're looking for. The outlaw glared at Gabe with undisguised hatred but raised his hands slowly. You must be the bastard who killed Dirk. Bolton's gonna enjoy making you pay for that. Bolton's not going to get the chance, Gabe replied coolly. How many others are with you? The outlaw spat on the ground. Go to hell. He's alone, Ruby said, stepping into the barn despite Gabe's earlier instruction. Aren't you, Ellis? Bolton wouldn't risk more men until he knew for sure the gold was here. The outlaw Ellis looked stunned to see her. How do you? You worked with Dirk on my father's ranch last year, Ruby said. You only stayed 2 weeks, but I remember you. You were always following him around like a loyal dog. Ellis's expression darkened. Dirk said you were a sharp one. Said you'd be worth coming back for, even without the gold. Looks like he was right about one thing: there ain't no gold here. Is there? No, Ruby confirmed. My father found a small vein, but it played out quickly. We used what we got to pay debts, nothing more. Ellis laughed bitterly. Bolton's not gonna like hearing that. He's counting on that gold to finance our trip to Mexico. Where's Bolton now? Gabe demanded. Camped about 5 miles east, near the old Carson place. Ellis said, apparently deciding cooperation might be his best chance at survival. He sent me to scout ahead, see if the place was worth hitting. There's 5 of them left, after you killed Dirk. Gabe glanced at Ruby. We need to tie him up, then get you somewhere safe. There's rope hanging on the wall behind him, Ruby said. And I'm not leaving my home. If Bolton's coming, I'll stand my ground. Gabe wanted to argue, but recognized the determination in her eyes. He motioned for Ellis to turn around, then bound his hands securely. We'll lock him in the root cellar, Ruby suggested. It's solid, no windows, and the door can be barred from the outside. Gabe nodded, impressed again by her practicality. Lead the way. They marched Ellis to the small cellar dug into a hillside behind the cabin. After securing him inside, Gabe turned to Ruby. We need to prepare. If Bolton follows the plan you described, he'll be here by morning when Ellis doesn't return. Ruby's face was pale in the moonlight, but her voice was steady. Then we'd better get ready for him. They spent the next few hours fortifying the cabin as best they could. Ruby showed Gabe the collection of weapons her father had accumulated: 2 rifles, the shotgun, and a pair of revolvers, along with ample ammunition for each. My father believed in being prepared, she explained as they loaded the weapons and positioned them strategically throughout the cabin. Smart man, Gabe said for the second time that night. I'm starting to think his daughter takes after him. Ruby smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face, lighting up her eyes and revealing a dimple in her left cheek. He would have liked you, she said softly. He always said I needed a man who could stand his ground, but who also knew the value of what's worth protecting. Their eyes met across the table where they were cleaning the guns, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that was growing stronger with each passing hour. Gabe cleared his throat, breaking the moment. We should try to get some rest while we can. Dawn's only a few hours away, and I suspect that's when Bolton will make his move if Ellis doesn't return. Ruby nodded, setting aside the revolver she'd been loading. I'll take the first watch if you want to sleep. Gabe shook his head. I'm too keyed up to sleep now. You rest. I'll wake you if anything happens. Ruby looked like she wanted to argue but then nodded, the events of the day finally catching up with her. Wake me in 2 hours to take over. You need rest too, Gabe. Yes, madam, he agreed with a small smile. Ruby disappeared into her room, leaving Gabe alone with his thoughts. He moved to the window, watching the moon slide across the sky as he contemplated the coming confrontation. Bolton was cunning and ruthless, qualities that had kept him at large despite the best efforts of lawmen across 3 territories. But he also had a weakness: arrogance. He believed himself untouchable, and that might give Gabe the edge he needed. And this time, Gabe had something to fight for beyond justice or vengeance. He had Ruby Lawson to protect, a woman whose courage and determination had awakened feelings he'd thought buried with his fiancée years ago. The night passed quietly. True to his word, Gabe woke Ruby after 2 hours, though he'd stretched it to 3, reluctant to disturb her rest. She emerged from her room looking remarkably refreshed, her auburn hair neatly braided, wearing a simple blue dress with a shawl around her shoulders against the night's chill. Anything? She asked, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. All quiet, Gabe replied. I checked on Ellis. He's secure, though not happy about it. Ruby nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. You should get some sleep now. The settee's more comfortable than the floor. Gabe hesitated, then conceded. Wake me at the first sign of trouble. I will, she promised. Gabe stretched out on the small settee, his gun within easy reach. Despite his certainty that sleep would elude him, he drifted off almost immediately, lulled by the sound of Ruby's soft movements around the cabin and the sense of rightness he felt in her presence. He woke to the first gray light of dawn and the smell of bacon frying. Ruby was at the stove, her back to him, humming softly as she cooked. You didn't wake me, Gabe observed, sitting up. Ruby turned, a smile playing at her lips. There was no need. No sign of Bolton or his men yet. Yet, Gabe repeated, rising to join her at the stove. They'll come. I know, Ruby said, her smile fading. But I thought we could at least have breakfast first. Facing outlaws on an empty stomach seems unwise. Gabe couldn't help but chuckle at her practical outlook. Can't argue with that logic. They ate quickly, both aware of the approaching danger despite the momentary calm. As they cleared the dishes, Gabe outlined his plan. If Bolton comes, he'll likely approach from the east, using the tree line for cover. We have the advantage of knowing the terrain and being able to prepare our positions. I want you to stay inside, away from the windows. I'll take position on the porch where I can see anyone approaching. Ruby frowned. I'm not hiding while you face them alone, Gabe. This is my home, and I'll defend it. Gabe started to protest, then sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing with her. All right, but at least stay inside. You can cover the windows. Give us crossfire if they try to rush the cabin. Ruby considered this, then nodded. That makes sense tactically. But Gabe. She hesitated, then stepped closer to him, looking up into his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. If something happens to me, I want you to know that these past hours, despite the danger, have meant more to me than I can say. Gabe reached up, his fingers hovering near her cheek, but not quite touching. Nothing's going to happen to you, Ruby. Not while I'm alive. The moments stretched between them, full of unspoken emotions and possibilities. Then a horse whinnied from the direction of the barn, breaking the spell. That's not my horse, Ruby whispered, her eyes widening. Gabe was instantly alert, moving to the window. In the early morning light, he could make out several riders emerging from the tree line to the east, exactly as he'd predicted. Bolton, he confirmed grimly. And his men. 5 of them, just as Ellis said. Ruby moved to his side, peering out the window. What do we do? Stick to the plan. You cover the windows, I'll take the porch. And Ruby. He turned to her, his expression serious. No heroics. These men won't hesitate to kill you. Ruby nodded, her face pale but determined as she picked up one of the rifles. Be careful, Gabe. Gabe checked his guns one last time, then moved to the door. Remember, wait for my signal before you start shooting. We want to draw them in close if we can. With that, he stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself behind one of the thick wooden support posts, his gun at the ready but not yet visible to the approaching riders. The Bolton gang approached slowly, obviously wary of a trap. They spread out as they neared the cabin, 2 circling toward the barn while the other 3 approached the front of the house directly. Gabe recognized Victor Bolton in the lead, a tall, lean man with a shock of white blonde hair and a distinctive scar across his left eye. Hello, the house, Bolton called out when they were about 50 yards away. We're looking for Ellis Turner. Seen him? Gabe remained silent, watching as the outlaws continued their approach. At 30 yards, Bolton called out again. We know someone's in there. We seen the smoke from your chimney. Come on out, and nobody needs to get hurt. Gabe glanced back through the window, meeting Ruby's eyes briefly. She nodded, indicating she was ready. Victor Bolton, Gabe called out, still keeping himself hidden behind the post. This is Federal Marshal Gabriel Wade. You and your men are under arrest for bank robbery and murder. Throw down your weapons. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Bolton burst into laughter. Well, I'll be damned. A lone marshal thinks he's going to arrest all of us. Boys, I think we found ourselves some entertainment for the morning. The gang spread out further, drawing their weapons. Gabe had hoped Bolton might surrender when faced with federal authority, but he wasn't surprised by the outlaws' response. Men like Bolton didn't surrender. They fought to the bitter end. Last chance, Bolton, Gabe called. Surrender now, or I start shooting. Bolton's response was a bullet that splintered the wood of the post inches from Gabe's head. The battle had begun. Gabe returned fire, his first shot catching one of Bolton's men in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. From inside the cabin, Ruby began firing as well, her shots carefully placed and surprisingly accurate. The three outlaws in front of the cabin dove for cover, while the two who had circled toward the barn began firing from that position. Gabe was effectively pinned down, able to return fire, but not to move from his position without exposing himself to the crossfire. Inside, Ruby moved from window to window, firing at any outlaw who showed himself. She managed to wound another of Bolton's men, hitting him in the leg as he tried to make a dash for the water trough. "You're a good shot, Miss Lawson," Gabe called, impressed despite the gravity of their situation. "My father made sure of it," Ruby called back, ducking as a bullet shattered the window above her head. The gunfight continued for several minutes, a stalemate with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Then Bolton shouted an order to his men, and two of them began circling around to the back of the cabin. "Ruby, they're trying to get behind us," Gabe warned. Ruby moved quickly to the back window, firing at the approaching outlaws and forcing them to retreat temporarily. But their ammunition wouldn't last forever, and Bolton seemed content to wait them out, keeping up a steady rate of fire that prevented Gabe from leaving his position on the porch. "We need to change the odds," Gabe called to Ruby during a brief lull in the shooting. "I'm going to try to make it to the barn, come at them from another angle." "That's too dangerous," Ruby protested. "They'll cut you down before you're halfway there." "I need you to provide covering fire," Gabe insisted. "On my signal, fire as fast as you can at their positions. Don't worry about aiming. Just keep their heads down for a few seconds." Ruby wanted to argue further, but knew they were running out of options. "Be careful," she said instead. Gabe nodded, then tensed, ready to make his move. "Now," he shouted, and Ruby began firing rapidly from the windows. Gabe sprinted from the porch toward the barn, zigzagging as bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. He was nearly there when a shot rang out from much closer than expected. One of Bolton's men had circled further around than they'd realized and was now behind the woodpile, with a clear shot at Gabe's unprotected back. "Gabe, behind you!" Ruby screamed from the cabin. Gabe tried to turn, to bring his gun to bear on this new threat, but he knew he'd be too late. In that moment, time seemed to slow. He could see the outlaw's finger tightening on the trigger, could almost trace the bullet's path through the air toward him. Then another shot cracked through the morning air. The outlaw jerked, a look of surprise crossing his face as blood blossomed on his chest. He fell forward, his unfired gun dropping from lifeless fingers. Gabe looked back toward the cabin in confusion. Ruby couldn't have made that shot from her position. Then he saw her, standing in the open doorway, his spare revolver in her hand, smoke still curling from the barrel. She'd left the safety of the cabin to save his life. "Get down," Gabe shouted, but it was too late. Bolton had seen her too, and his bullet caught Ruby in the side, sending her staggering back against the doorframe. "Ruby!" Gabe's anguished cry tore from his throat as he saw her fall. Rage and fear propelled him forward. He reached the barn and used its cover to pick off another of Bolton's men, who had risen from his position to get a better shot at the now vulnerable Ruby. 3 down, 2 to go. Bolton himself and one remaining gang member. But Ruby was hurt, possibly dying, and Gabe could think of nothing but reaching her side. He circled around the back of the barn, using the cover of the outbuildings to approach the cabin from the side opposite Bolton's position. As he neared, he could hear Bolton calling to his remaining man. "Jenkins, get around to the back door. The girls hit finish her off while I keep the marshal pinned down." Cold fury washed over Gabe at Bolton's words. He changed direction, moving silently through the tall grass until he had a clear view of Jenkins making his way toward the back of the cabin. Gabe took careful aim and fired. Jenkins dropped without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. Now it was just Gabe and Bolton, the culmination of a pursuit that had consumed years of Gabe's life. But in this moment, vengeance was secondary to his desperate need to reach Ruby. "It's just you and me now, Bolton," Gabe called, moving to a new position to keep the outlaw guessing. "Your men are dead or captured. There's no way out of this." "There's always a way out, Marshal," Bolton shouted back. "And I'm taking it right now." Gabe heard the sound of running footsteps, and then saw Bolton making a dash for one of the horses that had scattered during the gunfight. The outlaw leader was fast, already swinging into the saddle by the time Gabe had a clean shot. He fired, and Bolton jerked in the saddle but didn't fall. The outlaw kicked his horse into a gallop, heading for the tree line, one hand pressed to his side where Gabe's bullet had found its mark. Gabe faced a terrible choice: pursue Bolton or go to Ruby. It was no choice at all. He turned and ran for the cabin, his heart pounding with fear for the woman who had come to mean so much to him in so short a time. He found Ruby on the cabin floor, conscious but pale, her hand pressed to her side where blood seeped through her dress. "Ruby," he gasped, kneeling beside her. "How bad is it?" "Not as bad as it looks," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her pallor. "The bullet just grazed me, I think." "Did you get them all?" "Bolton got away, wounded," Gabe said, gently moving her hand to examine the wound. She was right, the bullet had torn through her dress and carved a furrow along her side, but hadn't penetrated deeply. "You're going to be fine, but we need to clean this and bandage it properly." Relief made him almost lightheaded. He helped her to a chair, then gathered clean cloths and water to tend to her wound. "I'm sorry about Bolton," Ruby said as Gabe carefully cleaned the blood from her side. "After all this time tracking him." Gabe shook his head. "Don't be. He won't get far with that wound. And right now, you're more important." He looked up at her, his eyes intense. "Why did you do it, Ruby? Why did you leave the safety of the cabin?" Ruby met his gaze unflinchingly. "He was going to shoot you in the back. I couldn't let that happen." "You could have been killed," Gabe said, his voice rough with emotion. "So could you," Ruby countered. "And I couldn't bear that thought. Not when I've just found you." Gabe's hands stilled in their task. "What do you mean?" Ruby took a deep breath. "I know it sounds crazy. We've known each other less than a day. But when you rode into that alley yesterday and saved my life, something changed for me. It was like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." Gabe's heart pounded as he heard his own feelings reflected in her words. "It's not crazy," he said softly. "I felt the same way. When that outlaw had his gun pointed at you, and you said take me instead. In that moment, all I could think was that I'd die for you. And I'd only just laid eyes on you." Ruby reached out, touching his face with gentle fingers. "What does it mean, Gabe? This feeling between us?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I want to find out. If you'll let me." Ruby smiled, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her wound. "I'd like that very much." Gabe finished bandaging her side, then helped her to her feet. "You should rest now. I need to secure the outlaws we captured and deal with the ones who didn't make it." Ruby nodded, understanding the grim task ahead of him. "What about Bolton?" "I'll track him once I know you're safe," Gabe promised. "He won't get far in his condition." "Be careful," Ruby said, her hand lingering on his arm. "I just found you. I'm not ready to lose you." Gabe covered her hand with his own. "You won't lose me, Ruby Lawson. I promise you that." The next few hours were busy ones. Gabe secured Ellis in the tack room of the barn, along with the wounded outlaw who had survived the gunfight. He then undertook the somber task of gathering the bodies of the fallen gang members, laying them out in the barn to await the sheriff's arrival. Ruby rested as instructed, but by midday she was up again, moving carefully but insisting on helping prepare a meal for them and their reluctant guests. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," Gabe observed as she set a pot of stew to simmer on the stove. "I believe that's a compliment, coming from you," Ruby replied with a small smile. Gabe couldn't help but smile back. "It is. Your strength amazes me, Ruby." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Gabe moved to the window, his hand on his gun, then relaxed. "It's Sheriff Tanner from Redemption Springs, with a couple of deputies," he told Ruby. "Someone must have heard the gunfire and reported it. He went out to meet them, explaining the situation and showing them the captured outlaws and the bodies of those who had fallen." Sheriff Tanner was appropriately impressed. "The Bolton gang, huh? There's bounties on all their heads. You'll be coming into a nice sum, Marshal Wade." Gabe nodded, though the money was the furthest thing from his mind. "Bolton himself got away, wounded. I need to go after him." "We'll take these men back to town," the sheriff offered. "The living to the jail, the dead to the undertaker. You go after Bolton." Gabe glanced toward the cabin, where Ruby stood in the doorway. "I need to make sure Miss Lawson is safe first. Bolton might circle back if he thinks she knows something about the gold his gang was after." Sheriff Tanner followed his gaze, understanding dawning in his weathered face. Miss Lawson can come to town. Stay at the hotel where we can keep an eye on her until you get back. I'm not leaving my ranch, Ruby called, having overheard their conversation. This is my home. The sheriff shrugged. Stubborn woman. Well, I could leave a deputy here if that would ease your mind, Marshal. Gabe considered this, then nodded. Thank you, Sheriff. That would help. He turned to Ruby. Will that be acceptable? I won't be gone long, I promise. Ruby didn't look happy about the arrangement, but nodded her agreement. Just come back safely, Gabe. That's all I ask. While the sheriff and his men dealt with the prisoners and the dead, Gabe prepared for his pursuit of Bolton. He checked his weapons, gathered provisions, and saddled his horse. Ruby followed him to the barn, watching silently as he made his preparations. You don't have to go after him, she finally said as he tightened the cinch on his saddle. The sheriff could send men. Or you could wait, gather a posse. Gabe turned to her, understanding the fear behind her words. Bolton won't stop until he's caught or killed, Ruby. As long as he's free, you're in danger. And I can't allow that. Ruby stepped closer, wincing slightly from her wound. I know. I have a bad feeling about this, Gabe. Gabe gently took her hands in his. I've been tracking Bolton for years. I know his patterns, his habits. And he's wounded now, not thinking clearly. This ends today, Ruby. And then. He hesitated, suddenly unsure of himself. And then. Ruby prompted, her eyes searching his. And then, if you'll have me, I'd like to come back. To you. Ruby's eyes widened, then softened with emotion. I'll be waiting, she whispered. Impulsively, Gabe leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a brief, tender kiss. It was over almost before it began, but it sealed a promise between them more binding than any words. I'll be back before sundown, Gabe said, his voice husky with emotion. Ruby nodded, stepping back as he mounted his horse. I'll hold you to that, Marshal Wade. With a final look at the woman who had so unexpectedly captured his heart, Gabe spurred his horse toward the tree line where Bolton had disappeared hours earlier. The trail was easy to follow. Bolton's wound had left a clear sign, drops of blood marking his passage through the undergrowth. As Gabe had predicted, Bolton hadn't gotten far. The outlaw's horse stood abandoned by a small stream about 3 miles from Ruby's ranch, its reins trailing in the water as it drank. Bolton himself was nowhere in sight, but a blood trail led away from the stream toward a jumble of rocks. Gabe dismounted, approaching cautiously with his gun drawn. Bolton, it's over. Come out with your hands up. A shot rang out from the rocks, the bullet whining past Gabe's head. Not today, Marshal. Bolton's voice was weaker than before, but still defiant. Not ever. Gabe took cover behind a tree, assessing the situation. Bolton was wounded, cornered, and desperate, a dangerous combination. Direct assault would be suicide. But time was on Gabe's side. Bolton was losing blood, and eventually, he would weaken too much to put up a fight. There's no way out of this, Bolton, Gabe called. Your gang is finished. Ellis and Jenkins are in custody. The others are dead. You're alone now. So are you, Marshal, Bolton called back, his voice raspy. One man against me. Not great odds, even with this hole in my side. Gabe didn't respond to the taunt, instead moving silently to a new position, circling around to approach the rocks from a different angle. Bolton was right about one thing: as long as he had a gun and the will to use it, he remained dangerous. For the next hour, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocks. Bolton, despite his wound, proved to be as cunning as his reputation suggested. Twice he nearly caught Gabe in the open, his bullets coming close enough that Gabe could feel their passage disturb the air near his face. But Gabe was patient, methodical, and as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, he knew Bolton was weakening. The outlaw's shots were becoming less accurate, the intervals between them longer. It's not too late to surrender, Bolton, Gabe called, genuinely preferring to take the man alive if possible. I can get you to a doctor. Bolton's laugh was bitter, ending in a wet cough that suggested his wound might be worse than Gabe had initially thought. We both know I'm not walking away from this, Marshal. But I'm damn well taking you with me. The declaration was followed by a flurry of movement and gunfire. Bolton broke from his cover, charging toward Gabe's position with reckless abandon, firing as he came. His first shot went wild, His second clipped Gabe's arm, drawing blood but not slowing him. Gabe stood his ground, took careful aim, and fired once. His bullet caught Bolton square in the chest, stopping the outlaw's charge as effectively as if he'd run into a wall. Bolton staggered, looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then back up at Gabe with an expression of almost comical surprise. "Didn't think. You had it in you." "Marshal," he gasped, then crumpled to the ground. Gabe approached cautiously, his gun still trained on the fallen outlaw. But there was no need for caution now. Victor Bolton, the scourge of 3 territories, was dead. With a heavy sigh, Gabe holstered his weapon and set about the grim task of preparing Bolton's body for transport back to Redemption Springs. He bound the wound in his own arm as best he could, then hoisted Bolton's body onto the outlaw's horse. The sun was low in the sky as Gabe began the journey back to Ruby's ranch, leading Bolton's horse behind his own. He had kept his promise. Bolton was no longer a threat, and he would return to Ruby before sundown. As the familiar outline of the ranch came into view, Gabe felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The mission that had consumed him for years was finally complete. Justice had been served for his fiancée's death, for the numerous other victims of the Bolton gang, and for those killed in the Redemption Springs bank robbery. But more importantly, he was returning to Ruby, to the future that suddenly stretched before him, filled with possibilities he had long since stopped allowing himself to imagine. The deputy the sheriff had left behind came out to meet him as he rode in, eyeing Bolton's body and Gabe's bandaged arm with professional interest. "Got him, I see," the deputy observed. "Miss Lawson will be relieved. She's been watching the road since you left." As if summoned by his words, Ruby appeared in the doorway of the cabin. Despite her wound, she hurried down the steps and across the yard as Gabe dismounted. "You're hurt," she said, her eyes fixed on his bandaged arm. "It's nothing," Gabe assured her. "Just a graze." "Bolton, dead," Gabe confirmed. He wouldn't surrender. Ruby nodded, her expression solemn but relieved. "It's over then." "Yes," Gabe said, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's over. And something new is beginning, if you'll have me." Ruby's smile was as bright as the setting sun behind her. "I think I made that clear before you left, Marshal Wade." The deputy cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "I'll, take care of Bolton's body, Marshal. Bring it into town for the bounty." Gabe nodded his thanks, his attention still focused on Ruby. As the deputy led both horses away, Gabe and Ruby stood facing each other in the fading light of day, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Gabe said softly. "After Sarah died, I locked that part of myself away. Became nothing but a badge and a gun, hunting men like Bolton. And now?" Ruby asked, her voice equally soft. Gabe reached out, drawing her gently into his arms. "Now I remember what it's like to want something beyond vengeance. To see a future with someone. With you, Ruby." Ruby leaned into his embrace, careful of both their wounds. "It's strange, isn't it? Yesterday morning, we were strangers. And now I can't imagine my life without you in it," Gabe finished for her. "I know it's fast, Ruby. Too fast, maybe. But I've learned that life is too short to waste time when you know something is right." Ruby looked up at him, her blue eyes luminous in the golden light of sunset. "And this feels right. More right than anything has in years," Gabe confessed. "I want to stay, Ruby. Here, with you. If you'll have me." Instead of answering with words, Ruby rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that spoke volumes. It was tender at first, then deepened as they both surrendered to the feelings that had grown so rapidly between them. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ruby smiled up at him. "I think that's a yes, Marshal Wade." Gabe laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but genuinely joyful. "I should hope so, Miss Lawson." Hand in hand, they walked back to the cabin as the last rays of the setting sun painted the western sky in hues of gold and crimson, a fitting end to a day that had brought death and new beginnings in equal measure. In the weeks that followed, Gabe and Ruby settled into a rhythm of shared life that felt as natural as breathing. Gabe resigned his position as a federal marshal, though he maintained his authority as a bounty hunter for the occasional job that took him away from the ranch. The bounty from the Bolton gang allowed them to pay off the mortgage on Ruby's ranch, securing her home for good. The townsfolk of Redemption Springs were initially skeptical of the whirlwind romance between the quiet rancher's daughter and the formidable former marshal. But as summer gave way to fall, and fall to winter, even the most cynical among them had to admit that the love between Gabe and Ruby was real and enduring. They were married on a crisp December morning, with snow dusting the pine trees around the small church in Redemption Springs. Ruby wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, and Gabe wore a new suit bought specifically for the occasion. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which lasted well into the night. As they danced under the stars, Gabe pulled Ruby close and whispered in her ear, "Do you remember what I said that day in the alley, when I lowered my gun?" Ruby looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the light of the lanterns strung overhead. "You said you'd die for me." "I meant it then," Gabe said solemnly. "But now I know the truth living for you is even better." Ruby's laugh was joyous as she spun in his arms. "A wise decision, Marshal Wade. Because I plan to keep you around for a very long time." "Is that a promise, Mrs. Wade?" Gabe asked, his heart full to bursting with love for this remarkable woman who had saved him in ways she might never fully understand. "It is," Ruby confirmed, rising on tiptoes to seal the promise with a kiss. "For as long as we both shall live." And in the years that followed, years filled with laughter, tears, children, and grandchildren, they kept that promise. The former marshal and the rancher's daughter built a life together that neither could have imagined on that fateful day when she begged, "Please don't shoot. Take me instead." And he lowered his gun with the words, "I'd die for you," on his lips. Their love story became something of a legend in Redemption Springs, told and retold by those who had witnessed its beginning. But for Gabe and Ruby, it was simply their life, a testament to the power of courage, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways in which love can find us when we least expect it. As they grew older together, watching their children follow their own paths, Ruby sometimes thought back to that day at the bank, to the terror that had gripped her and the certainty that her life was about to end. How strange that what had seemed like the worst day of her life had led to the greatest happiness she had ever known. "What are you thinking about?" Gabe would ask, finding her lost in thought on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in the same colors as that first evening they had spent together. And Ruby would smile, taking his weathered hand in hers, still feeling the same thrill at his touch that she had felt when they were young. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most terrible moments can lead us to the most beautiful places. And I'm grateful for every step of our journey, even the frightening ones." Gabe would nod, understanding as he always did, and they would sit together in the comfortable silence of two people who had faced death together and chosen love instead, watching the day end and the stars emerge, secure in the knowledge that their love story, unexpected and extraordinary as it was, had been worth every moment of danger that brought them together. And so they lived, not just surviving but thriving, in the shadow of the mountains that had witnessed their first meeting, their first kiss, their first promise to each other. A promise that had begun with a plea for life and ended with a pledge of love that would last beyond their final breaths, echoing through the generations that followed, a testament to the power of those fateful words, "Please don't shoot. Take me instead," and the reply that had changed everything, "I'd die for you."